Well, how many of you have ratified the answers? How many of you have memorized the dates, the names of the places, the people, the rulers, and where the wars were fought and stuff? And how many of you have asked genuine questions like why did it happen? How did it happen? What if it hadn't happened? Such hypothetical questions, the analytical questions, whys, hows, and synthetical questions like how can we improve upon it? How could it have been avoided? Such questions. Well, Einstein was one of those students during his studenthood in his school. He had such a lot of, let's say, yes, arguments with his teachers, and one such argument is what this chapter starts with a with his history teacher, Mr. Braun. But then he never meant any rudeness, he never meant any insult to any teacher. He was just his own self. He spoke his own mind, and the teachers took it otherwise, took it ill. Well, because of that very reason, and such critical questions as I just spoke about in the middle of the class or when the class was in full flow, as such questions would arise, then the teacher felt offended, and many complaints of him went to the head teacher, and he was ultimately expelled from his school. This story is an episode in this very character of his, but it has a very good message coming out that students, just gathering of knowledge is not the ultimate motto of education. It's about the formation of your insight, formation of critical and creative thinking, how to analyze, how to look into the things, interpret, understand it well, and then create your own thing. Find yourself through education. Let's see how this story builds up. Yes, students, I have taken up this little endeavor to make a reading video on Albert Einstein at school. We will, of course, do it online live. How Albert Einstein, when he was a little schoolboy, fared, and how rebellious he was, how into arguments he fell with his teachers, and an extract from his biography by Patrick Pringle. And the first phase here in this chapter is the dialogue, exchange of dialogues between him and his history teacher, Mr. Braun. So here it goes. In what year, Einstein asked the history teacher, did the Prussians defeat the French at Waterloo? I don't know, sir. Why don't you know? You have been told it often enough. I must have forgotten. Did you ever try to learn? Asked Mr. Braun. No, sir, Albert replied with his usual unthinking honesty. Why not? Because, sir, I can't see any point in learning dates. One can always look them up in a book. Mr. Braun was speechless for a few moments. You amaze me, Einstein, he said at last. Don't you realize that you can always look most things up in books? That applies to all the facts you learn at school. Yes, sir. Then I suppose you don't see any point in learning facts? Frankly, sir, I don't, said Albert. Now, students, did you see? Do you see here how unthinkingly honest he is? And then the teacher says, then you don't believe in education at all? Oh, yes, sir, I do. I don't think learning facts is education. Learning facts is not education, sir. Then the history teacher says, in that case, perhaps you will be so kind as to tell the class the Einstein theory of education. Albert flushed. Well, that was a hint of sarcasm in the teacher's voice. I think it's not facts that matter, but ideas, he said. I don't see the point in learning the dates of battles or even which of the armies killed more men. I'd rather be interested in learning why those soldiers were trying to kill each other. That's enough. Mr. Brown's eyes were cold and cruel. We don't want a lecture from you, Einstein. You will stay in for an extra period today. Although I don't imagine it will do you much good, it won't do the school any good either. You are a disgrace. I don't know why you continue to come. It's not my wish, sir, Albert pointed out. Then you are an ungrateful boy and ought to be ashamed of yourself. I suggest you ask your father to take you away. Well, Albert always had to go through such humiliating classes where the teachers used to scold him like anything, and he felt miserable when he left school that afternoon as well. Not that it had been a bad day, most days were bad now anyway, but because he had to go back to the hateful place the next morning. And guess what is this hateful place that is being referred to here? Yes, it is the school that he hated the most. Albert hated the most. He only wished his father would take him away, but there was no point in even asking. He knew the answer. He would have to stay until he had completed his diploma. Well, that's as regards the first phase. Students, when he goes back to home and he has a very good friend in Yuri, Yuri, a very good friend in Yuri who understood him to a certain extent. And he had a conversation with him. This is all about the dialogue exchange that he has. He does not like the neighborhood in which he lives. He lives in a slum neighborhood. His father cannot afford more. And Einstein is troubled by his landlady also. If you see this, I am highlighting it. His landlady beat her children regularly, and every Saturday her husband came drunk and beat her. So that was another trouble. And to make the matters worse, the landlady even didn't like him playing violin, because that was the ultimate refuge of Einstein. As a pastime, as a hobby, he played violin as well at home, but the lady would call it as whining. She could not understand what violin was like. There was nothing musical about it for her. And Yuri is concerned about her, sure concerned about him, about his friend Albert as well. Of course, there are gang wars around him. The slum children, they are more of ruffians. They fight with each other. They indulge in violence and obscenities also. They use abusive language, which Albert does not ever like. Well, this dialogue between his cousin sister Elsa and him is interesting. You will see that the sister is intrigued and surprised by the way Einstein does not learn things. And this sister happens to actually this she happens to come to Munich from Berlin. She happens to visit Munich and just sees that her cousin brother Albert, that is Einstein, is not at all happy. He seems to be distressed. And that is the dialogue you see. I'm sure you could learn enough to pass the exams, Albert, if you tried. She said, I know lots of boys who are much more stupid than you are who get through. They say you don't have to know anything, you just don't have to know anything. You don't have to understand what you're taught, just be able to repeat it in the exams. See, students, here the sister advises him not to understand anything. She says, you can rectify. And of course, you are stupid, but there are many other more stupid students. So she actually finds Albert stupid. And then Albert replies, he says, that's the whole trouble, sister. I'm no good at learning things by heart. And then she answers, see how she answers. You don't need to be good at it. Anyone can learn like a parrot. You just don't try. Just try learning it like a parrot, that means she means. And yet, I always see you with a book under your arm. What is the one you are reading? And this is the book on geology that Einstein is reading. A book on geology. She says, geology? Rocks and things? Do you learn that? No. We have hardly any science at school. Then why are you studying it? Because I like it. Isn't that a good enough reason? Elsa sighed. You're right, of course, Albert, but it won't help with your diploma. Well, this little students, this exchange of dialogue, this talk between the brother and sister tells us much about Albert. Albert does everything, used to do everything that his heart would tell him. He, if you remember, we had read it a little before, he had unthinking honesty. Right, even if he had to suffer for it, and the teachers would not appreciate him, except for one teacher, mathematics teacher, whom we will know about a little later in the story. Uh, Look at the top paragraph here, and this is the talk between his landlady, Albert's landlady, and him. Like I said, the landlady is not at all appreciative of Einstein's playing violin, because apart from studies on science, his only comfort was music, and he played his violin regularly until his landlady asked him to stop. And look what she says. She says, that wailing gets on my nerves. That wailing gets on my nerves. Wailing means crying, making sounds that does not make any sense. That looks like crying. There's enough noise in this house with all the kids howling. Well, that is how the landlady looks at his violin. As a result of which, he always says, I must get away from here. And who other than his good friend Yuri would share his worries and anxieties? So desperate is he that he asks his friend Yuri to arrange a doctor who could get him a medical certificate, a break for 6 months. And he says, it's absurd that I should go on like this. In the end, it will turn out I have been wasting my father's money. And if you go ahead, children, go on reading it. Yuri is inquisitive. Yuri says, and then what will you do there? Like, what would you do then? He says, I don't know. If I go to Milan, Milan is in Italy, if you know. If I go to Milan, I'm afraid my father will send me back. Unless, and then his eyes gleamed with a sudden idea. Yuri, do you know any friendly doctors? Now that is where an idea struck him. And this is the idea about the medical certificate. He asks his friend Yuri to refer his case to one of the one of the doctors who is friendly enough to give him medical certificate, give Albert a medical certificate of unfitness. I know a lot of medical students and some of them are friendly, said Yuri. Doctor, no, I've never had enough money to go to one. Why? That is where Albert expresses his wish. He says, suppose that I had a nervous breakdown. Suppose a doctor would say it's bad for me to go to school and I need to get right away from it. Well, that is the plan. That is a kind of idea that struck him. And Yuri says, I can't imagine a doctor saying that. Albert said, I must try to find a doctor who specializes in nerves. And you will see, students, as this exchange of dialogues go on, Yuri comes across a doctor. Actually, he is reminded of a doctor who is a fresh practitionist. He is from the study of nerves. He could be a psychiatrist or a psychologist who had been a friend of Yuri as well. So now Albert stands a good chance of getting a medical certificate. So this dialogue exchange of talks, you read on. Yuri told him there are plenty of them. He hesitated for a moment and then added rather reluctantly, I'll ask some of my students if they know one, if you like. And Albert says, will you? Oh, thank you, Yuri. Well, I mean, he thinks that he would be helped. I want you students to look at the top of this page. This is Yuri telling Albert about an appointment that he has for Albert. He says, I have an appointment for you for tomorrow evening. Here's the address. He handed Albert a piece of paper. Dr. Ernest Vale. Is he a specialist in nervous troubles? Asked Albert. Well, not exactly, Yuri admitted. As a matter of fact, he only qualified as a doctor last week. You may even be his first patient. You knew him as a student then? I've known Ernest for years. Yuri hesitated for a few moments. Though Yuri, that means now has a reference, and his old friend, that is Dr. Ernest Vale, who is a freshly practicing doctor. Probably Albert could be his first patient. I've known Ernest for years, he says. He is not a fool. And now he quickly goes on to say, he is not a fool. He tells Albert, he is not a fool. Einstein says, what do you mean? And then Yuri answers, don't try to pull the wool over his eyes, that's all. Be frank with him, but don't pretend you have got what you haven't. Don't pretend you have got what you haven't. Not that you would deceive anyone. You are the world's worst liar. Now, this is one of those most important lines you must know, that is told about Einstein. Yuri says that Einstein or his friend Albert is the world's worst liar. Now, this line has to be dissected well, students, because he could not lie. He was a boy of unthinking honesty. And he says that tell the fact to the doctor. Don't tell him something that he doesn't have. Tell him that, sir, I want a medical certificate and I can go through this nervous breakdown. I have not yet been pushed to such a state, but I may meet with a nervous breakdown. Well, this is the conversation between the psychiatrist friend, Dr. Ernest Vale. He could be a psychologist, even a doctor of nerves, The doctor, the psychology doctor, Dr. Ernest Vale, and Albert Einstein. So Albert visits the doctor's clinic, and here goes the conversation. I don't really know how to describe my trouble, Dr. Vale, he began. Don't try. Yuri has already given me a history of the case, said the young doctor with a friendly smile. Oh, what did he say? Only that you want me to think you have had a nervous breakdown and say that you mustn't go back, you must not go back to that school. Oh dear, Albert's face fell. He shouldn't have told you that. Why not? Isn't it true then? Now Albert says, yes, that's the trouble. Now you'll say there's nothing wrong with me and you will tell me to go back to school. And then doctor understood what Einstein meant, because he could see students. He could see, in fact, doctor can clearly see in Einstein that he is distressed. And if he continues going to the school, he can really meet with a nervous breakdown. After all, he's a doctor. He notices well in advance. So he says, don't be too sure of that, Albert. As a matter of fact, I am pretty sure. Look at this line, very important line. As a matter of fact, I am pretty sure you are in a nervous state about that school. But I haven't told you anything about it, said Albert. How can you know that? Because you wouldn't have come to see me about this if you hadn't been pretty close to a nervous breakdown. That's why. Now, said the doctor briskly, now, if I certify that you have had a nervous breakdown and must stay away from school for a while. What will you do? I'll go to Italy, said Albert, to Milan, where my parents are. And what will you do there? I'll try to get into an Italian college or institute. How can you without a diploma? Now, this was a question worth asking because doctor cannot just give the certificate and leave Albert at in doldrums without the school, like out from the school and nowhere. So he wanted to assure. So he says, how can you get into an Italian college or institute without a diploma? I will ask my mathematics teacher to give me something about my work, and perhaps that will be enough. I have learned all the maths they teach at school and a bit more, said Albert. Well, it's up to you, doctor said. I doubt if it will come off, but I can see you are not doing yourself or anyone else much good by staying here. Well, how long would you like me to say you would stay away from school? That means here the doctor wants to ask Albert what's the period of time that he wants the break for. So would 6 months be all right? Albert is relieved. He says, this is very kind of you. It is nothing. I've only just stopped being a student myself, so I know how you feel, how you are. And this is Dr. Vale handing him the certificate. Best of luck. That's how Albert got his medical certificate. Now, next up, you remember, students, Albert had told the doctor that he would be getting a recommendation letter from his mathematics teacher, so that he could get an admission in a higher institute or a college in Milan, Italy. So that is exactly what Yuri reminds him of as well. After he manages to get the medical certificate, Yuri says, don't forget to get a reference in writing from your mathematics teacher first. Albert, don't forget that, Yuri reminds him. And the mathematics teacher is Mr. Kosh. Mr. Kosh is highly appreciative of Albert. He is the only teacher, like I said in the very beginning as well. Mr. Koch is the only teacher in his school who praises Albert for what he is, for what a genius he is. And he must have been appreciating his questions, and he must have been very fond of him. So he says, he willingly gave Albert the reference he wanted. And then he says, Albert, if I say I cannot teach you anymore, and probably you'll soon be able to teach me, will that be all right? He asked. And this makes Albert blush. He says, that's saying too much, sir. It's only the truth. It's only the truth. But all right, I'll put it more seriously. So that he does, in a very glowing reference, he writes the certificate, and Mr. Kosh made the point that Albert was ready immediately to enter a college or institute for the study of higher mathematics. And see how he goes on to appreciate him. He says, I'm sorry. Just as I said, he must have grown fond of Albert. So he says, I'm sorry you are leaving us, Albert. Although you are wasting your time in my class, he said. And look how Albert responds. It's almost the only class where I'm not wasting my time, sir, said Albert. But how did you know I'm leaving, sir? You wouldn't have asked me for this reference otherwise. I thought you would wonder. Well, there's nothing to wonder about, Einstein. I knew you were going to leave before you knew yourself, said the maths teacher, Mr. Kosh. Albert was puzzled. What did the teacher mean? Now, Teacher knows better, particularly in this case. No? And he found out later. And that's the last phase of the chapter. Much to his surprise, Albert goes to the school next day and he finds that the head teacher or the principal, the head teacher, had already sent for him. That means he had asked for him to be sent to his office. And you will see that the head teacher had planned to expel him. He has been fed up of all the complaints from all the teachers, and now see the conversation between them in the office. The head teacher says, "I am not going to punish you," the head teacher said to Albert's surprise. "Your work is terrible, and I am not prepared to have you here any longer, Einstein. I want you to leave the school now." "Leave school now?" repeated Albert, dazed. "That is what I said." "You mean," said Albert, "that I am to be expelled?" "You can take it that way if you wish, Einstein." The head teacher was not mincing words. "Well, the simplest thing will be for you to go of your own accord, and then the question won't arise." That means the question of expelling you won't arise. You go of your own accord. Albert was dazed. He was shocked. Now that his medical certificate that he had with such great difficulty managed to get was of no use. So he says, "But what crime have I committed, sir?" "Your presence in the classroom makes it impossible for the teacher to teach and for the other pupils to learn. You refuse to learn. You are in constant rebellion, and no serious work can be done while you are there." Albert felt the medical certificate almost burning a hole in his pocket. This is one of the most important lines in the chapter, students. Albert felt the medical certificate almost burning a hole in his pocket. "I was going to leave anyway," he said. Albert said. "Then we are in agreement, at least, Einstein. Then we are in agreement." For a moment, Albert was tempted to tell the man what he thought of him and of his school, because students, he didn't hold the school in high esteem, nor did the teachers of tall stature in his views. Only teacher he respected was the maths teacher. But then he stopped himself. He wanted to tell all that he felt, but then he stopped himself. Without another word, holding his head high, he stalked out. "Shut the door after you!" shouted the head. Albert ignored him. He walked straight on out of the school, where he had spent 5 miserable years, without turning his head to give it a last look. How he could not think of anyone he wanted to say goodbye except Yuri. And he said, "Goodbye, Yuri." And Yuri said, "Good luck, dear. You are going to a wonderful country. I hope you will be happier there." And the rest is all history, students. You know how this boy, who had been expelled so humiliatingly, went on to make a history, gave theorems, and the most of all, the theory of relativity and whatnot to the world. So, students, the next chapter in the life of Albert as a student started right from here. And do you think he would have become Albert Einstein if he had adhered to his cousin sister Elsa's advice? Well, I know that you will say, "No, sir. He would never have gone on to become the Einstein that we know." And now it's a lesson for all of us that just gathering knowledge, general knowledge from here and there, is not education. Just ratifying, memorizing facts and figures is not at all education, because he proved through his life. We have to develop an insight. Of course, learn, the whats, learn the whos and the whoms and the whats, but never ignore the whys and the hows, right? Well, Einstein has taught us a wonderful lesson. Being in the eye of the storm, being at the receiving end of all the criticisms from all his teachers, and perhaps he may have come across with many more such criticisms in his life ahead as well, but he proved his point. Thank you, students, so much.